The wind in New Mexico territory did not simply blow, it scoured. It was a living, breathing entity composed of grit, dry heat, and a relentless will to strip the softness off anything that dared to stand upright. Eliza Hart wiped a mixture of sweat and red dust from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand, leaving a muddy streak across her pale skin. She was 22 years old, and every single one of those years seemed to be weighing down on her shoulders at this precise moment. She stood back to assess the structure that was slowly rising from the hard-packed earth. It was not a palace. It was barely a cabin. It was a rough 12 by 14-foot box made of ponderosa pine logs she had dragged, stripped, and notched with her own 2 hands. Missouri felt like it was a million miles away, a lifetime ago, where trees were gentle giants that offered shade, not formidable opponents that fought the axe with every swing. Here, the land was an adversary. Eliza adjusted the brim of her battered felt hat. She had been here for 3 months, 90 days of waking up before the sun, working until her muscles trembled like struck guitar strings, and falling asleep with the taste of wood smoke and loneliness in her mouth. She had come to claim a homestead left to her by a distant uncle she had never met, a man who had died trying to tame this particular patch of the Southwest. Most women her age back in St. Louis were worrying about lace patterns or whether a certain gentleman would call on a Sunday afternoon. Eliza had never known that life. She had been raised in a household of discipline, where idleness was a sin and self-reliance was the only religion that put bread on the table. She had never been in love. She had never felt the touch of a man's hand that lingered longer than a polite greeting. She had never belonged to anyone. And standing here in the shadow of the crimson mesas, she realized that was exactly how she wanted it. She walked over to the water bucket. It was nearly empty. The spring was 50 yards away, bubbling up from a crack in the limestone, a miracle in this arid landscape. That spring was the reason she was here. It was the reason she could survive. And, though she tried not to think about it too much, it was the reason the men in Pine Mesa looked at her with narrowed, calculating eyes. "One more log," she whispered to the empty air. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the vast silence of the valley. "Just get the ridgepole up. Eliza, then you have a roof." 5 miles to the east, the town of Pine Mesa sat like a brown stain on the beige landscape. It was a collection of clapboard buildings and false fronts, holding onto the edge of civilization by its fingernails. The air smelled of cattle manure, stale beer, and the metallic tang of money changing hands. Inside the cramped office of the sheriff, the air was stagnant. Sheriff Rourke sat behind his desk, a man whose face looked like it had been carved out of granite and left out in the rain too long. He was cleaning a fingernail with a hunting knife. Across from him sat Silas Barlow. Barlow was a man who wore his wealth the way other men wore weapons, openly and with the intent to intimidate. He wore a suit of fine wool that must have been torture in the heat, but he never seemed to sweat. He owned the Double Bar Ranch, which encompassed nearly 10,000 acres of scrub grass and dust, but cows could not eat dust, and cows definitely could not drink it. "The girl is still out there," Barlow said, his voice smooth and low. "My boys rode past the ridge yesterday. Said she's got the walls up." Rourke grunted, not looking up from his fingernail. "It is her land. Silas, the deed is good. I checked it myself when she rolled into town 3 months ago." "It is good water," Barlow countered, leaning forward. "Water that flows right into the drainage my herd uses when we move them to the north pasture. If she fences that off, or if she decides to start farming and diverts it." "She is one woman," Rourke said. "She will break. They always break. The winter will come, or the Apaches, or just the sheer quiet. The quiet drives them mad faster than hunger." "I don't like waiting on the weather," Barlow said. Standing up, he walked to the window and looked out at the dusty street where a stray dog was barking at a wagon wheel. "And I don't like uncertainty. That spring is the key to the valley. If I control the water, I control the beef price in this county. Do not do anything stupid." "Silas," Rourke said, finally looking up. His eyes were cold, the eyes of a man who knew the law was a flexible thing, but who also knew it had a breaking point. She is a white woman, alone. If something happens to her that looks like foul play, the territorial marshal will come sniffing around. I cannot protect you from the federal government, Barlow smiled, a thin stretching of lips that did not reach his eyes. I don't need foul play. Sheriff, I just need pressure. Everyone has a price, or a breaking point. We just have to find hers. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and burning orange. The temperature was dropping. In the high desert, the heat vanished the moment the sun looked away, replaced by a biting chill that settled into the bones. High on a limestone ridge overlooking the valley, a shadow moved. It was not an animal. Though it moved with the silence of a cougar, it was a man. Kalen adjusted his position behind a twisted juniper tree. He was Diné, what the white men called Navajo. He was a warrior who had seen the world change around him, shrinking day by day as the fences went up and the soldiers came. But this valley, this was an old path. His ancestors had walked this way to the winter hunting grounds for 100 years. The spring down there was sacred. It was life. He watched the woman below. From this distance, she was small, a figure wrapped in a faded gray dress with a hem pinned up to her knees to allow for movement. He had been watching her for weeks. At first, he had expected her to be like the other white intruders, noisy, destructive, tearing at the earth with greed. He expected her to bring men with guns, but she was alone. He watched her struggle with a heavy pine log. It was the ridgepole, the spine of her shelter. It was too heavy for one person. He saw her tie a rope around one end, throwing the line over the upright support she had already placed. She was using leverage, a simple pulley system made of rope and friction. Strong, Kalen thought. Though he did not speak the word, he saw her slip in the mud. The log swung dangerously, nearly crushing her shoulder. She did not scream. She did not throw down the rope in anger. She merely steadied herself, wiped her hands on her skirt, and pulled again. There was something about her tenacity that unsettled him. The white men usually took what they wanted by force. This woman was building something out of nothing, bleeding into the soil to do it. He should hate her. She was on land that should have been free for the deer and the antelope. But as he watched the final beam settle into the notch with a dull thud, he felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was not hatred. It was a begrudging respect. Kalen sat back on his heels. The wind ruffled his black hair, which was tied back with a strip of leather. He knew the men from the town, the ones with the cold eyes and the smell of whiskey, wanted this water. He had seen their riders scouting the perimeter. If they took this land, they would bring hundreds of cattle that would trample the earth into cement and foul the water with their filth. This woman. She took only a bucketful at a time. She moved carefully. That night, Kalen retreated to his small camp hidden deep in a box canyon 2 miles away. He sat by his small fire, chewing on a strip of dried venison. The image of the woman wrestling the log stayed with him. When he finally slept, the dream came. It was vivid, more real than the stone beneath his head. He was in his hogan, the traditional dwelling of his people. The fire was burning low, and standing across from him, tending the flames, was the white woman. Her hair was not covered by a hat. It was loose, falling like spun gold over her shoulders. She looked at him, and her eyes were not filled with the fear that all white settlers had for his kind. They were calm. They were the eyes of a woman who knew who she was. She did not speak, but the sense of peace in the dream was so profound that when Kalen woke up before dawn, his heart was aching with a longing he could not name. The next morning, the silence of the valley was broken by the rattle of wheels and the snort of horses. Eliza was up on the roof of her cabin, nailing down the cedar shakes she had spent the last week splitting. She paused, hammering in midair, and looked toward the crude wagon track that led to town. A dust cloud heralded the arrival of the stagecoach, though coach was a generous term for the mud-spattered wagon that Eli Briggs drove. Eli was a man of indeterminate age, with a beard that looked like a bird's nest and eyes that sparkled with the joy of knowing everyone's business. He was the mail carrier, the delivery service, and the newspaper all rolled into one. Eliza climbed down the ladder, her boots thudding on the hard earth. She wiped her hands on her apron, feeling a rare spark of excitement, supplies, and perhaps a letter from home, though she knew there was no one left in Missouri who cared enough to write. "Whoa, they're easy, you stubborn mules," Eli shouted, pulling the team to a halt in front of the cabin. He jumped down, his knees cracking audibly. "Morning, Miss Hart. See you got the roof on, I'll be damned. Pardon my language. But I didn't think you'd get that timber up alone." "Good morning, Mr. Briggs," Eliza said, offering him a ladle of water from her bucket. "Necessity is a fine teacher." Eli drank greedily, water dripping into his beard. "Ah, that is sweet water, sweetest in the territory. You're sitting on a gold mine. Ma'am, even if it is just water." Eliza stiffened slightly. "It is just a home. Mr. Briggs, did you bring the flour?" "I did," Eli said, hauling a sack from the back of the wagon. "And the nails, and a bag of dried apples from Mrs. O'Rourke. She said you might need something sweet." Eliza smiled. Martha O'Rourke was the sheriff's sister-in-law, a woman trapped in a loveless marriage to the sheriff's brother. But she had been the only soul in Pine Mesa to look at Eliza with kindness rather than suspicion. "That is very kind of her," Eliza said. "How is the town?" Eli hesitated. The sparkle left his eyes for a moment, replaced by a flicker of concern. He leaned against the wagon wheel, lowering his voice even though there was no one around for miles. "Town is tense, Miss Hart. Barlow lost 20 head of cattle to the heat last week. He is in a foul mood. And Sheriff Rourke, well, he is asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About you, about how long you plan to stay, about whether you are protected out here." Eli looked around the empty valley. "You know, it ain't just the weather you have to worry about. There's talk of Indians, Navajo renegades who refused the reservation treaty. They say they're ghosting through these hills." Eliza looked toward the tree line. The forest was dense and dark, the ponderosa pines standing like silent sentinels. She had felt eyes on her before, the sensation of being watched, but she had dismissed it as the imagination of a city girl alone in the wild. "I have a rifle, Mr. Briggs," Eliza said, her voice steady. "And I know how to use it." "A rifle is good," Eli said, climbing back onto his wagon seat. "But eyes in the back of your head are better. You watch yourself. Miss Hart, Barlow is a man who thinks the world owes him everything he sees, and right now, he is looking this way." Eliza watched the wagon rumble away, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the still air. She felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She turned back to her cabin. It stood solid and real, the fresh wood gleaming in the sun. It was hers. She walked to the door frame. She had not hung the heavy oak door yet and stepped inside. It was dim and cool. The smell of pine resin was overwhelming, a clean, sharp scent. She ran her hand along the rough wall. "I am not leaving," she said to the empty room. "I am not leaving." 3 days later, the weather turned. The sky, usually a relentless blue, turned a milky white, then a bruised gray. The wind picked up, shifting from the south to the north, carrying the scent of ozone and distant rain. Eliza spent the morning gathering firewood. The nights were getting colder. She had built a fireplace of river stones and mud, but she needed fuel. She was working near the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned out into the sagebrush. She was bending down to pick up a fallen branch when she saw it. It was a footprint. Eliza froze. She knew the tracks of the animals here, the two-toed print of the deer, the pad of the coyote, the tiny, hand-like print of the raccoon. This was a human print, but it was not the print of a boot. It was the soft, distinct outline of a moccasin. She slowly straightened up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. The wind sighed through the pine needles, a mournful sound. She was not alone. Unbeknownst to her, 50 feet away, concealed within the dense canopy of a large pine. Kalen watched. He had not meant to leave a track. He had been careless. distracted by the way the sunlight caught the loose strands of hair escaping her bonnet. He saw her fear. He saw the way her hand went instinctively to the knife at her belt. He saw her posture shift from worker to defender. He also saw something else. From the direction of the cattle trail to the south, 3 riders were approaching. They were not hiding. They were riding loud, their voices carrying over the wind. They were Barlow's men. Kaylin knew them by the way they rode heavy in the saddle. Arrogant. Eliza heard them a moment later. She grabbed her bundle of wood and ran back toward the cabin. She reached the porch just as the 3 riders crested the small rise that separated her valley from the open range. The lead rider was a man named Skinner. He had a face that looked like it had been broken and put back together wrong. He reined in his horse, kicking up a spray of dirt near Eliza's clean laundry line. "Afternoon, ma'am," Skinner drawled. He did not touch his hat. Eliza dropped the wood on the porch and stood tall. "Can I help you?" "Just passing through," Skinner said, his eyes roaming over the cabin, the spring, and finally settling on Eliza. "Mr. Barlow wanted us to check on his neighbors. Make sure you haven't been washed away or eaten by wolves." "I am fine," Eliza said coldly. "You can tell Mr. Barlow I'm quite comfortable." "Comfortable," Skinner laughed. It was an ugly sound. "For now, but you know, little lady, this land, it's harsh. Accidents happen. Fires happen. Wells run dry." "Is that a threat?" Eliza asked. "It's neighborly advice," Skinner said. He leaned over his saddle horn. "This is a big country for a girl alone. A smart girl would sell out while the price is fair. Go back east. Find a husband. Have some babies. This dirt, it ain't for pretty things." Eliza felt a flash of anger so hot it burned her throat. "This dirt is mine. Now get off it." Skinner's face hardened. He looked at his companions, then back at her. For a second, Eliza thought he might draw his gun, or ride her down. The air crackled with violence. Then, from the woods behind the cabin, a blue jay screeched. It was a sharp, piercing sound. Skinner's horse spooked, dancing sideways. Skinner fought the reins, cursing. "Crazy nag," he muttered. He glared at Eliza. "We'll be seeing you, Miss Hart. You think about that offer." He wheeled his horse around and galloped off, his men following in a cloud of dust. Eliza stood trembling on the porch. She was not trembling from fear, but from the adrenaline dump of confrontation. She looked toward the woods where the bird had called. It was too quiet. Up in the tree line, Kaylin lowered the small stone he had thrown to startle the horse. He did not know why he had done it. It was a small thing, but he did not like the way the man named Skinner looked at her. It was the look a wolf gives a wounded fawn. He slipped away into the shadows, moving silently back toward the high ground. That evening, the storm finally broke, but not with rain. It was a dry storm, full of lightning that sheeted across the sky without a drop of moisture to quench the thirsty earth. Thunder rolled like caissons across the valley floor. Eliza sat inside her cabin. She had barred the door. The oil lamp cast flickering shadows on the mud-chinked walls. She had her father's old Henry repeating rifle across her lap. She was polishing the brass receiver with a rag, the rhythmic motion soothing her nerves. She thought about Missouri, about the parlor with the velvet sofa where she used to sit and read. It was safe there, boring, stifling, but safe. "No," she said aloud. "Safety is a cage." She looked around the room. It was rough. It was empty. But every log in the wall was a testament to her will. She thought about the footprint in the woods, the moccasin print, and she thought about Skinner's threat. Accidents happen. She was surrounded. On one side, the raw, indifferent violence of nature. On the other, the calculated greed of men. And somewhere in the shadows, the unknown element, the owner of the moccasin. She laid the rifle on the table and walked to the small window she had covered with oiled paper until she could afford glass. She couldn't see anything but darkness, but she could feel the vastness of the land out there. "I will not run," she whispered. Deep in the canyon, Kaylin sat by his fire. He was carving a piece of ironwood. He was shaping it into a small figure. A horse, But his mind was on the cabin in the valley. He knew what Barlow was. He had seen men like Barlow come and go. They were like locusts. They consumed everything until there was nothing left. And then they moved on. But the woman, she was like the pinyon pine. She dug her roots in. He looked up at the stars, which were appearing through the gaps in the storm clouds. The Navajos believed that everything had a spirit. The wind, the rocks, the water. Perhaps, he thought, even a white woman could have a spirit worth saving. He put the carving away and wrapped his blanket around his shoulders. He would watch for one more day, just to see what she did, just to see if she would run. But in his heart, he already knew the answer. And that knowledge terrified him more than any gun Barlow's men could carry. Because if she stayed, he knew he would not be able to stay away. And that path led only to blood. The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the new shingles, testing the strength of the work. Inside, Eliza Hart blew out the lamp and sat in the darkness, listening to the night, waiting for the morning to bring whatever battle came next. She was alone, but for the first time in her life, she was free. The wind that night had teeth. It came down from the high peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, stripping the heat from the ground and leaving behind a chill that settled deep into the marrow of the bone. It was 3 a.m, and the valley was a bowl of restless shadows. Eliza Hart was awake before her eyes opened. Sleep, for her, was never a deep well. It was a shallow stream, easily disturbed. She lay still under her heavy quilt, listening. The wind rattled the cedar shakes on the roof she had nailed down herself, a sound she was used to. But then came another sound, a sharp, panicked whinny from the lean-to stable she had built for her 2 horses. She threw off the quilt, the cold air biting at her skin through her cotton nightdress. She did not hesitate. In this country, hesitation was a luxury that cost too much. She pulled on her boots, not bothering with stockings, and threw her heavy wool coat over her nightdress. She grabbed the oil lantern from the table and the Colt Navy revolver she kept loaded beside her pillow. It was an old gun, heavy and rusted in spots, but it fired true. She lit the lantern, the flame sputtering before catching hold, casting a yellow sphere of light against the encroaching dark. She unbarred the door and stepped out onto the porch. The wind nearly extinguished her light. She shielded it with her body, squinting toward the stable. "Easy," she called out, her voice snatched away by the gale. "Easy now." The horses were pacing nervously, kicking at the wooden rails. Eliza approached carefully, raising the lantern high. There was no mountain lion, no wolf. The animals were spooked by something that had passed, not something that remained. She checked the latch on the gate. It was secure. She was about to turn back, chiding herself for her nerves, when the lantern light caught something wet on the hard-packed earth near the water trough. It was dark, almost black in the dim light, but Eliza knew the color of blood. She lowered the lantern. It was not a single drop. It was a trail, a heavy, inconsistent drag of droplets and smears, as if something wounded had stumbled through the yard. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She followed the trail with her eyes. It did not lead away from the homestead. It led toward the cabin. Eliza felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the wind washing over her. She had just come from the cabin. She had been asleep. She tightened her grip on the revolver, her knuckles white. She followed the trail back to her porch. The blood smeared across the wooden steps. It stopped at the door she had just exited, the door she had unbarred. She had been so focused on the horses that she hadn't looked behind her. Someone had slipped in while she was out. Eliza stood at the threshold, the wind whipping her hair across her face. This was the moment the town had warned her about, the moment every woman alone on the frontier dreaded. She took a breath, sharp and jagged, and kicked the door fully open. Raising the gun, "Get out!" she shouted, the gun shaking slightly in her hand. "I am armed." The cabin was silent save for the crackling of the embers in the hearth. She stepped inside, swinging the lantern. The light swept across the rough-hewn table, the single chair, her narrow bed. Then, the light caught a boot, a moccasin. Actually, he was huddled in the corner between the fireplace and the wall. a shadow within a shadow. He was not standing. He was slumped against the logs, one hand pressing a wad of cloth against his side, the other hanging limp. Eliza leveled the pistol at his chest. "Don't move," she ordered. The man lifted his head slowly. It was the Navajo warrior. She recognized the sharp angles of his face, the heavy, straight brows, the hair tied back with the leather. But the terrifying specter she had imagined lurking in the woods was gone. In his place was a man whose skin had gone the color of old ash. He looked at the gun, then up at her face. There was no malice in his eyes. There was no plea for mercy, either. It was the flat, accepting gaze of a wolf caught in a trap, waiting for the final blow. He was shivering, violent tremors that shook his entire frame. "Water," he rasped. The word was barely a sound. Eliza's finger hovered over the trigger. The logic of Pine Mesa screamed in her ear. He is an intruder. He is a savage. He is likely the one who robbed the freight wagons. Shoot him or drag him out to die in the cold. It is the only safe way. But then she saw the blood pooling beneath him, soaking into the dirt floor she had packed so carefully. He wasn't attacking. He was dying. She looked at his hand, the one pressing the wound. Blood was seeping between his fingers, dark and fast. If she threw him out, he would be dead within the hour. "Damn it!" she hissed through gritted teeth. She lowered the hammer of the gun, but kept it within reach on the table. She slammed the door shut against the wind and barred it. She knelt beside him, setting the lantern on the floor. "Let me see," she said, her voice commanding, though her stomach churned. He flinched when she reached for him, his muscles coiling instinctively, but he was too weak to stop her. She peeled his hand away. His shirt, a mix of calico and buckskin, was torn. Beneath it, a jagged furrow tore across his lower ribs, deep and ugly. It wasn't a bullet hole. It looked like he had been grazed by a heavy slug or torn by a ricochet. "You are bleeding to death," she stated flatly. He watched her, his breathing shallow and rapid. He did not speak. Eliza stood up and went to her supply chest. She moved with frantic efficiency. A bottle of corn whiskey she kept for toothaches, a clean strip of linen from her petticoat, a needle and a spool of heavy thread she used for canvas. She returned to him. "This is going to burn," she warned. She poured the whiskey over the wound. The warrior arched his back, a guttural sound tearing from his throat. His teeth clenched so hard she thought they might shatter. He did not scream. He slammed his head back against the logs, his eyes squeezing shut, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. "Breathe," Eliza said, her own hands trembling as she threaded the needle. "You have to breathe." She had stitched torn grain sacks. She had stitched the hide of a mule once. But human skin was different. It was warm. It was resilient. As she pushed the needle through the edge of the wound, she felt the toughness of him, the sheer density of his muscle. He was built of ironwood and leather. He watched her now. His eyes were open again, dark pools reflecting the firelight. He watched her hands that were stained with his blood. He watched her face, pale and focused, her lip bitten in concentration. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of silence broken only by the hiss of the fire and the man's ragged breathing. When she tied off the final knot and cut the thread, Eliza sat back on her heels, exhausted. She felt lightheaded. She soaked a rag in water and wiped the blood from his side, her touch gentler now that the violence of the surgery was done. His skin was burning hot. Fever was already setting in. "You need to rest," she said, more to herself than him. She couldn't leave him on the floor. It was too cold. Summoning a strength she didn't know she had, she grabbed him under the arms. "Help me," she grunted. "You have to help me." Together, they managed to get him closer to the hearth, onto a pile of bear skins she used as a rug. He collapsed onto the fur, his energy spent. Eliza fed the fire, building it up until the heat flushed her cheeks. She sat in her rocking chair, the gun in her lap, watching him. Why had she done it? Sheriff Rourke would call her a traitor. Silas Barlow would call her a fool. If anyone found him here, her life in this valley was over. She would be branded. The man stirred. His eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever. He looked around the room, confused, until his gaze landed on her. He stared at her for a long time, as if trying to place her face in his memory. "Eliza," he whispered. Eliza froze. The rocking chair stopped mid-swing. The sound of her name on his tongue was a physical shock, like a splash of ice water. She leaned forward, gripping the arms of the chair. "What did you say?" "Eliza," he repeated, the syllables clumsy but distinct. "Eliza? Hart?" She stood up slowly, the blood draining from her face. "How do you know my name?" He did not answer. His eyes slipped closed, and he drifted back into the dark waters of unconsciousness. Eliza backed away until she hit the table. He knew her name. He knew who she was. That meant he hadn't just stumbled upon this cabin by accident. He had been watching. He had been listening. For how long the wind howled outside, scratching at the door like a living thing trying to get in. But the danger was already inside, and she had just sewn him back together, 5 miles away. The erratic light of torches cut through the gloom of Pine Mesa. The town was not asleep. It was buzzing with the angry energy of a kicked beehive. In the center of the muddy street, a freight wagon sat with a broken axle. The canvas cover was slashed, and crates were overturned. A crowd of men stood around it, their collars turned up against the cold. Sheriff Rourke stood on the boardwalk, a shotgun cradled in the crook of his arm. Beside him stood Silas Barlow, looking immaculate despite the late hour. "It was a raiding party," the wagon driver was shouting, holding a bloody rag to a gash on his forehead. "They came out of the rocks, painted faces. They took the rifles and the ammunition." "Navajo," Rourke asked, his voice booming over the wind. "Who else?" Barlow interjected smoothly. He stepped down into the street, addressing the gathering crowd. "We have been tolerant. We have been patient. And how do they repay us? By stealing the very tools we need to defend our homes." A murmur of agreement rippled through the men. Fear was a dry tinder, and Barlow was holding the match. "They cannot have gone far." Barlow continued. "My foreman, Skinner, says he cut one of them down. Winged him good with a Winchester. He will be bleeding. He will be looking for a hole to crawl into." "We ride at first light," Rourke announced. "I want a posse. Every able-bodied man with a horse and a gun." "Check the outlying homesteads," Barlow suggested, his voice low enough that only Rourke could hear, but loud enough to carry to the front row. "These savages, they get desperate. They might break into a barn, or a cabin. God help anyone who gets in their way." He looked toward the west, toward the valley where the spring water flowed, especially a woman alone. Morning came to Eliza's cabin with a gray, reluctant light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Eliza had not slept. She had sat by the fire, watching the chest of the stranger rise and fall. When the sun finally crested the ridge, she moved. She knew she could not keep him on the floor. If Rourke came, and he would come. She knew it in her gut he would look in the main room first. She boiled water and made a strong tea from willow bark, forcing a few spoonfuls between the man's lips. He swallowed reflexively, groaning. "You have to move," she told him. "Up." He opened his eyes. They were clearer today, the fever having burned down to embers. He looked at her, and she saw the question in them. "The sheriff will come," she said. "If they find you, they will hang you, and they will likely hang me for helping you." She pointed to the loft. It was a small space above the main room, reached by a rough ladder. It was where she stored her flour and dried herbs. It was dark, hot, and cramped. The warrior Colin nodded. He understood. He grit his teeth and pushed himself up. The effort turned his face gray again. Fresh blood bloomed on the bandage, but he did not complain. He leaned heavily on Eliza. He smelled of pine smoke, sage, and the metallic tang of old blood. He was heavy, a solid weight against her side. For a moment, she was acutely aware of the strangeness of it. A man, a warrior, leaning on her for survival. She guided him up the ladder. It was a grueling process. Every rung was a battle against gravity and pain. When he finally rolled onto the floor of the loft, he lay gasping for air. Eliza scrambled up after him. She pulled sacks of flour and a pile of old blankets in front of him, creating a wall that would hide him from anyone standing on the floor below. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "No matter what you hear, do not make a sound." He looked at her, his hand reaching out to grasp her wrist. His grip was weak, but his skin was warm. "Why?" he asked. One word. Eliza looked at his hand on her wrist, then at his face. "Because I don't let things die if I can help it," she said. She climbed down and pulled the ladder away, propping it against the far wall so it looked unused. She swept the floor where he had lain, scrubbing the dirt to hide the blood stains, scattering fresh ashes from the hearth to cover the damp spots. She had just finished throwing the bloody rags into the fire when she heard it, the sound of hooves. Many of them. She went to the window. A group of 6 riders was coming up the trail. Sheriff Rourke was in the lead, his tin star dull in the morning light. Beside him was Skinner, Barlow's foreman. Eliza's heart slammed against her chest. She looked at the fire. The rags were burning, but they were smoking heavily, a thick, dark smoke that smelled different than wood. She grabbed the poker and shoved the rags deeper into the coals, piling logs on top to mask the smell. Smoke, fire. It was life, but right now, it was a beacon. She smoothed her hair, wiped her hands on her apron, and opened the door before they could knock. "Sheriff," she said, stepping out onto the porch. She forced her voice to be steady. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Rourke reined on his horse. He looked tired. He looked past her, into the open door of the cabin. "Morning, Miss Hart. We are tracking a wounded animal, a 2-legged one." "A Navajo," Skinner spat, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her boots. "Robbed the supply wagon. Killed a mule. I put a bullet in him, but he got away." "I haven't seen anyone." Eliza lied. The lie tasted like copper in her mouth. She had been raised to tell the truth. Her father would have whipped her for a lie, but her father wasn't here. "He is bleeding bad," Rourke said. "He wouldn't get far. Mind if we take a look around?" It wasn't a request. "I have nothing to hide," Eliza said, stepping aside. "But wipe your boots." "I just swept." Rourke dismounted heavily. Skinner stayed on his horse, his eyes scanning the roofline, the stable, the woods. Rourke walked into the cabin. The air was thick with the heat of the fire and the smell of something. "Smells like you are burning wool," Rourke noted, sniffing the air. "Old socks," Eliza said quickly. "They were beyond darning." Rourke walked to the center of the room. He looked at the floor. The dirt was disturbed near the hearth. He looked at the table. The whiskey bottle was uncorked. "Having a drink this early, Miss Hart?" Rourke asked, tapping the bottle. "For a toothache," Eliza said. She touched her jaw. "The cold air makes it flare up." Rourke stared at her. His eyes were hard, calculating. He was a man who knew when people were hiding things, but he also knew Eliza Hart. She was a stern, religious woman, not the type to harbor a fugitive. He looked up at the ceiling, at the loft. "What is up there?" he asked. "Flour. Winter supplies," Eliza said. She held her breath. Rourke walked to the ladder. He put a hand on the rung. Eliza's hand drifted toward the pocket of her apron, where she had slipped a small paring knife. It was a ridiculous weapon against a sheriff, but panic was making her irrational. "From outside," Skinner shouted. "Sheriff found tracks heading toward the creek." Rourke paused. He looked at the ladder, then back at Eliza. He took his hand off the rung. "Lock your door, Miss Hart," Rourke said softly. "If he is out there, he is dangerous, and he is desperate." "I can take care of myself," Eliza said. "I hope so," Rourke said. "For your sake." He walked out, mounting his horse. The posse turned and rode toward the creek, following a false trail or perhaps just the tracks of a deer. Eliza watched them go until they were specks in the distance. Her knees gave way, and she sat down hard on the porch step. She was shaking uncontrollably. She looked back into the cabin. The fire was roaring now, consuming the bloody evidence. She had chosen. She had lied to the law to save a man she did not know. She looked up at the loft. She was no longer just a homesteader. She was an accomplice. And the man up there? He knew her name. The wind picked up again, whistling through the cracks in the logs. It sounded like a warning. The spring bubbled nearby, indifferent to the drama. The water would bring them back. Barlow would come back. And next time, a lie might not be enough to stop them. The days that followed the departure of the posse bled into one another, creating a strange, suspended reality within the walls of the cabin. To the outside world, Eliza Hart was a spinster homesteader clinging to a patch of dust and stubbornness. Inside, she was a jailer, a nurse, and a conspirator. The recovery of the Navajo warrior was a silent symphony. Kalen did not complain. He did not ask for comfort. He accepted the water she brought to the loft, and the bowls of corn mush and venison stew, with a nod that was more dignified than a bow. They moved around each other like two planets forced into the same orbit, wary of the gravity that pulled them together. For the first 3 days, he stayed in the loft, a shadow among the flour sacks. Eliza would climb the ladder, her skirts gathered in one hand, a bowl in the other, and find him awake, his dark eyes tracking her movement. He was healing with a speed that frightened her. The wound on his side, which would have kept a man from the city in bed for a month, was already knitting together. It was as if his body refused to acknowledge the injury, dismissing it as an inconvenience to survival. By the 4th day, the silence broke, not with words, but with action. Eliza was outside, struggling with a heavy block of oak she intended to split for the stove. The axe was dull, and her swing was tired. The wood refused to yield. She wiped sweat from her eyes, frustration rising in her throat like bile. She raised the axe for another strike, but a hand caught the handle before she could bring it down. She gasped, spinning around. Cullen stood there. He was pale, and a sheen of sweat coated his upper lip, betraying the pain he was hiding. But he stood straight. He took the axe from her unresisting fingers. He did not look at her. He looked at the wood, with a fluid motion that utilized the weight of the axe rather than brute force. He brought the blade down. The oak split cleanly in two with a satisfying crack. He set up another log. Crack. Another crack. "You should not be out of bed," Eliza said, her voice sounding shrill in the quiet afternoon. "You will tear your stitches." Kalen paused, leaning on the axe handle. He looked at the pile of wood, then at the roof where a shingle had come loose in the wind, and finally at the drainage ditch she had started digging but abandoned due to fatigue. "Work pays for life," he said. His voice was gravel, the English words heavy and deliberate. "I eat your food. I will do your work." "You don't owe me anything," Eliza protested, though she knew in the West, everyone owed someone something. He ignored her. He continued to chop. Eliza watched him, mesmerized despite herself. The men in Pine Mesa, the cowhands, the drifters, they worked with a lot of noise. They grunted, they cursed, they spat. They made sure you knew how hard they were laboring. Kalen worked with a terrifying economy of motion. There was no wasted energy, no showmanship, just a quiet, relentless competence. He fixed the roof that afternoon, moving over the cedar shakes with the grace of a cat. He finished digging the drainage ditch the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. He did not try to take over her cabin. He simply moved through the tasks she struggled with, smoothing the rough edges of her existence. Eliza found herself watching him from the kitchen window while she kneaded dough. She noticed the way his hair, black as a raven's wing, fell over his shoulders. She noticed the way his muscles moved beneath the calico shirt she had given him, one that had belonged to her father, which was too broad in the shoulders but too short in the sleeves for Colin. She had expected a savage. She had expected violence. Instead, she found a stillness that was more powerful than any shout. It unsettled her. It made her aware of the empty spaces in her own life, spaces she had filled with work and discipline. One evening, a week after his arrival, Colin came into the cabin just as the sun was setting. He did not go to the loft. He stood by the door, his body tense. "Water," he said. "There is water in the bucket," Eliza said, pointing to the bench. "No," Colin said. He gestured outside, toward the spring. Water. The cows. Eliza frowned. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed him out onto the porch. The valley was bathed in the golden light of the magic hour, that brief window when the harsh landscape turned soft and beautiful. Kalin pointed to the south, where the creek wound its way through the brush. Barlow. Cows. Eliza squinted. She saw nothing but the scrub oak and the sage. I don't see anything. Kalin crouched down, picking up a stick. He drew a line in the dirt. Water here, he said, tapping one side of the line. Cows here. He tapped the other. Then he dragged the stick across the line. Cows come. The water is dirty. No drink. He was telling her that Barlow was moving his herd closer to the headwaters. If the cattle got into the spring upstream, they would muddy the water, trample the banks, and effectively ruin her water source. It was a common tactic. You didn't have to shoot a homesteader to get rid of them. You just had to make their life impossible. Show me, Eliza said. She saddled her mare. Bess. Kalin refused a horse. He moved on foot, running alongside the mare with an easy, loping gait that seemed to eat up the miles without effort. They moved away from the cabin, following the creek bed upstream toward the box canyon that marked the edge of Barlow's land. Half a mile from the cabin, Kalin stopped. He held up a hand. Eliza reined in Bess. The air was still, too still. Colin pointed to the mud near the creek bank. The ground was churned up. Hundreds of hoof prints. Fresh manure steamed in the cool air. The water, usually crystal clear, was running brown and silty. He pushed them down, Eliza whispered. He pushed them past the boundary line. Kalin did not look at the cows. He was looking at the ground near a cluster of willows. He beckoned Eliza over. She dismounted and walked to where he stood. He pointed to a set of tracks in the soft earth. They were not hoof prints. They were boot prints. Man, Kalin said. Watch. He pointed to a spot where the grass was flattened, where a cigarette butt had been crushed into the dirt. Someone had been sitting here, watching the cabin, watching her. Eliza felt a chill crawl up her spine. How long? Kalin held up 2 fingers. 2 days. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. They know I am not dead. They look. Eliza looked at the boot print. It was a heavy, square-toed boot, the kind Skinner wore, the kind the sheriff wore. We should go back, she said, her voice trembling slightly. As they made their way back to the cabin, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the valley. Eliza rode in silence, the weight of the invisible eyes pressing on her. She was not just fighting the elements anymore. She was fighting a siege. 2 days later, the law came to call. It was mid-morning. Eliza was in the garden, hoeing rows for the winter squash she hoped to plant in the spring. Kalin was in the woods, gathering pine nuts, or so he said. Eliza suspected he was patrolling, circling the cabin like a guard dog. She heard the buggy before she saw it. Sheriff Rourke drove a black carriage with red wheels, a touch of vanity that seemed at odds with his rugged persona. He pulled up to the gate, the leather harness jingling. Morning, Miss Hart, Rourke called out, tipping his hat. Eliza leaned on her hoe. Sheriff, you're far from town. Just making my rounds, Rourke said. Climbing down, he tied the reins to the fence post. Checking on the isolated folks. Lots of unrest lately. Have you heard about the raiding party? I heard what you told me last week, Eliza said. Rourke walked to the gate, resting his arms on the top rail. His eyes swept over the yard. He looked at the new shingles on the roof. He looked at the neatly stacked wood pile. You have been busy, he noted. That is a lot of wood for one woman to chop. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. I have a strong back, Sheriff, and fear of freezing is a good motivator. Rourke smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Indeed, fear is a powerful thing. Tell me, Miss Hart, do you ever get lonely out here? A woman like you are young, pretty. If you don't mind me saying, this life, it hardens a person. I like the quiet, Eliza said. Quiet can be dangerous. Rourke said softly. Things happen in the quiet. People disappear, or they get hurt, and there is no one to hear them scream. It was a threat wrapped in concern, delivered with a smile. Is that a warning, Sheriff? It is an observation, Rourke said. He opened the gate and stepped into the yard. I just want to make sure you are safe. Maybe take a look inside, check your window latches. Eliza stepped into his path. My windows are fine. Sheriff, and unless you have a warrant, I would prefer you stay out of my home. Rourke stopped. His smile faded. For a moment, the mask slipped, and Eliza saw the cold, corrupt man beneath. You are a stubborn woman. Eliza, he said, dropping the Miss Hart. Stubbornness gets people killed in this territory. Before he could say more, another rider appeared on the rise. It was Silas Barlow. He was riding a massive bay gelding, looking every inch the cattle baron. He rode right up to the gate, looking down at Rourke and Eliza. Sheriff, Barlow nodded. Miss Hart. Mr. Barlow? Eliza said stiffly. Barlow leaned forward on his saddle horn. I was just riding by. Thought I would make you that offer one last time. $500 for the deed. Cash. You can be on a stagecoach to St. Louis by Friday. The land is not for sale, Eliza said. Barlow sighed, as if dealing with a petulant child. Eliza, look around you. The water is getting muddy. The winter is coming. The Indians are restless. Do you really think you can hold this place alone? I am holding it, she said. For now, Barlow said. But I can offer you protection. If you sell, I will make sure you get to town safely. If you stay. He let the sentence hang in the air. Well, I cannot be responsible for what happens when the law cannot reach you. He looked at Rourke. Right. Sheriff, territory's a big place. Rourke agreed. It's hard to police every acre. Eliza gripped the handle of the hoe until her knuckles turned white. She was standing between the law and the money, and she realized neither of them was on her side. They were two heads of the same snake. Get off my land, Eliza said. Her voice was low, shaking, but clear. Both of you, Barlow chuckled. Have it your way, but when the first snow falls, don't say I didn't try to be a gentleman. He wheeled his horse around and galloped off. Rourke lingered for a moment longer. A smart girl would have taken the money, Rourke said. He tipped his hat again, a gesture that now felt like a mockery, and climbed back into his buggy. Eliza watched them leave. When they were gone, she dropped the hoe and leaned against the fence, her legs trembling. A rustle in the bushes made her jump. Kalen stepped out from behind the woodpile. He had been there the whole time. He had a knife in his hand, held low against his leg. They are wolves, Colin said. Yes, Eliza whispered. They are. The tension in the valley tightened like a wet rope drying in the sun. Every sound the cry of a hawk. The snap of a twig made Eliza jump. She slept with the revolver under her pillow. Kalen slept in the loft, but she knew he was awake most of the night. She could hear his breathing, a steady rhythm in the darkness. One evening, 3 days after Barlow's visit, the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. A storm was brewing. Not the dry lightning of before, but a heavy, weeping rain. Eliza was on the porch, taking down the laundry she had hung up to dry. The wind was whipping the sheets around her, tangling them. She reached up to unpin a heavy quilt. Let me, a voice said. Kalen was beside her. He reached up, his height giving him an advantage, and unpinned the quilt. As he pulled it down, a gust of wind caught it, billowing it out like a sail. It wrapped around Eliza, blinding her. She stumbled back, her heel catching on a loose board she had been meaning to nail down. She tipped backward, flailing. She expected the hard impact of the wood. Instead, she hit a wall of solid muscle. Kalen had dropped the quilt and caught her. One arm went around her waist, pulling her flush against him to keep her from falling. His other hand gripped her upper arm. For a moment, time stopped. Eliza looked up. Her face was inches from his. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. She could feel the heat of his body radiating through his shirt. She could feel the strength of his hand on her waist, a grip that was firm, protective, and undeniably masculine. She had never been this close to a man before. Not like this. The men in Missouri had been polite distances away in parlors. This was raw. It was immediate. She felt a flush rise from her neck to her cheeks, a heat that had nothing to do with the exertion. Her breath hitched in her throat. She saw Colin's eyes widen slightly. He looked at her mouth, then up to her eyes. His nostrils flared, as if he were taking in her scent. The wind howled around them, flapping the laundry. But in that small circle of contact, there was only the thudding of two hearts. "Eliza," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement. The sound of her name, spoken in his deep, rough voice, sent a shiver through her that terrified her. It was a feeling of being known, of being seen. Then, as quickly as it had happened, he let go. He stepped back, his hands retreating to his sides. He looked down, breaking his gaze. "The board," he said, pointing to the loose plank. "I will fix it." "Yes," Eliza breathed, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." He turned and walked quickly toward the woodpile, disappearing into the shadows of the side yard. Eliza stood on the porch, the wind whipping her hair, her hand pressing against her waist where his hand had been. The skin there felt branded. She gathered the laundry with trembling hands and went inside, bolting the door. She leaned against the wood, closing her eyes. She was afraid of Barlow. She was afraid of Rourke. But standing there in the dim light of the cabin, she realized she was afraid of something else, too. She was afraid of how safe she felt in the arms of a man the world called a savage, and she was afraid of how much she wanted him to touch her again. The rain came that night, a steady, drumming downpour that turned the dust to mud. It should have been a relief, a blessing for the dry earth. But to Eliza, it sounded like a clock ticking. She sat by the fire, mending a shirt. Kaylin was in the loft, whittling. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the heavy, charged silence of two people who had crossed a line and didn't know how to step back. Suddenly, Kaylin stopped whittling. The scraping sound ceased. Eliza looked up. "What is it?" Kaylin came down the ladder. He moved to the window, peering out into the rain-slicked darkness. "Horses," he said. "The wind," Eliza suggested. "No," Callan said. He turned to her. "Many horses, shod, not moving fast, moving quietly." Eliza stood up, the shirt falling to the floor. "Barlow." "Maybe," Callan said. "Or maybe something worse." He went to the corner and picked up the rifle. He checked the chamber. Then he looked at Eliza. "If they come," he said, "you do not open the door. You shoot." "What about you?" Eliza asked. "I go out," Callan said. "I am the reason they come. I will lead them away." "No," Eliza said, surprising herself with the force of her voice. She grabbed his arm. "You are still healing. If you go out there in the cold and the wet, with a posse hunting you, you will die." Callan looked at her hand on his arm. He covered it with his own for a brief second. "Better I die than you burn," he said. "This is my home," Eliza said fiercely. "And you are my guest. We stay, we fight." Callan looked at her, a mixture of admiration and sorrow in his face. He nodded slowly. "We fight," he agreed. He blew out the lamp. The cabin plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the dying embers of the fire. They sat in the dark, shoulder to shoulder, listening to the rain and the phantom sound of hooves in the distance. The waiting was the hardest part. It was the rising action of a storm that had not yet broken. The indrawn breath before the scream. Outside, the New Mexico night was vast and indifferent. But inside the cabin, two people from different worlds gripped their weapons and waited for the morning that might never come. The clock was ticking, and every second brought the fire closer to the fuse. The rumors in Pine Mesa did not spread like fire. They spread like a sickness. They moved from the saloon to the general store, and from the livery stable to the church pews, carrying on whispers that grew louder with every repetition. They said that Eliza Hart was not merely a stubborn woman holding on to land she had no business working. They said she was a traitor to her race. They said she had been seen in the moonlight with a savage. They said she had forgotten what it meant to be a decent Christian woman. The town, which had once viewed her with a mixture of pity and annoyance, now turned its collective back. When Eliza rode into town for supplies, the silence that greeted her was louder than any shout. Women pulled their skirts aside as she passed on the boardwalk. Men stopped their conversations and spat tobacco juice into the dust, their eyes hard and condemning. But the town's malice was distant. The threat at home was immediate. It was a Tuesday morning, the air crisp and smelling of juniper. When Eliza walked out to the perimeter fence to check the line, she carried a hammer and a pouch of nails, intending to fix a loose rail. She stopped dead when she reached the corner post nearest the trail. The wood had been freshly whittled. Deep, jagged cuts marred the weathered pine. It was not a random act of vandalism. It was a message carved with a heavy knife. Go or bleed. Eliza stared at the letters. Sap oozed from the wounds in the wood, looking like amber tears. She ran a gloved finger over the rough carving. It was raw, violent. It was a psychological blow intended to shatter her nerve. She heard a twig snap behind her. She spun around, her hand dropping to the revolver at her hip. It was Kellen. He was looking at the post, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He did not need to read English to understand the intent. He saw the violence in the strokes of the knife. He turned and walked back toward the cabin without a word. Eliza followed him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When she entered the cabin, she found him gathering his few belongings. He was rolling his blanket. He was checking the edge of his knife. "What are you doing?" Eliza asked, her voice sharp. Kalen did not look up. "I go." "You are not healed," Eliza said. "Your side." "My side is strong enough," Kalen interrupted. He stood up, slinging the blanket roll over his shoulder. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of pain in his dark eyes, not physical pain, but a deep, weary sorrow. "I am the poison here. Eliza, they hate you because of me. If I go, the hate goes." "Do not be a fool," Eliza snapped. She stepped between him and the door, blocking his path. She was half his size, but she stood her ground like a mountain. "Do you think Barlow cares about you? You are just the excuse. He wants the water. He wants the land. If you leave, he will find another reason to drive me out. He will say I am a witch or a thief, or simply a woman alone who fell down a well." "I bring the guns," Kalen said, his voice rising slightly. "Skinner, Rourke, they hunt me. If I am not here, they do not come to your door with rifles." "They are already at my door," Eliza cried. She grabbed the lapels of his buckskin jacket, forcing him to look at her. "I do not need you to save me by leaving me behind. That is the coward's way out. Colin, that is what men do when they want to feel noble without doing the hard work of standing fast." Kalen froze. He looked down at her hands gripping his jacket. He could have pushed her aside with one arm, but he did not move. The air between them crackled with the energy of the argument, a conflict of character against character. Two iron wills clashing. "I am not a coward," Kalen said softly, the words vibrating in his chest. "Then stay," Eliza challenged him, her eyes burning. "Stay and help me fight, because if you walk out that door, you are not saving me. You are just leaving me to die alone." Kalen stared at her for a long moment. He saw the fear she was trying to hide, but he also saw the ferocious courage that fueled her anger. Slowly, the tension left his shoulders. He reached up and covered her hands with his own. His skin was rough, calloused, and warm. "I'll stay," he said. "We fight." The truce was sealed, but the siege continued. The next day, the rattle of wagon wheels announced the arrival of Eli Briggs. The mail carrier looked older than usual, his shoulders slumped, his beard gray with road dust. He did not shout his usual greeting. Eliza met him at the porch. Kalen remained inside, a shadow near the window, rifle in hand. "Morning, Eli," Eliza said. She did not offer him water this time. The tension was too high for pleasantries. Eli climbed down and looked around nervously, checking the tree line. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He did not hand it to her immediately. "Miss Hart," Eli said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Things are getting ugly in town. Barlow is stirring the pot. He is telling folks that the Apaches and the Navajo have joined forces. He is scaring them into a frenzy." "Lies," Eliza said. "I know," Eli said. He handed her the paper. "I found this, at the site where the wagon was robbed. It was stomped into the mud, half burned." Eliza unfolded the scrap. It was a corner of a ledger page. It was singed and stained with tobacco juice, but the handwriting was legible. It was a bill of lading for crates of Winchester rifles, signed by Silas Barlow. And the date was 2 days before the robbery. "Why would Barlow be shipping rifles to himself?" Eliza asked. Frowning, "He wasn't," Eli said. "Those rifles were never on the wagon. Miss Hart, the driver, confessed to me last night, after a bottle of whiskey. The wagon was empty. Barlow had his men shoot it up, burn it, and blame the Indians. He is creating a panic so he can bring in the territorial militia. If the militia comes, they will clear this whole valley. Every Indian, every homesteader who gets in the way. Gone." Eliza felt a cold knot in her stomach. It was a land grab, pure and simple, dressed up as a war. "And there is more," Eli added. "Martha, Mrs. O'Rourke, she wanted you to know, the sheriff is planning a sweep of the valley on Friday, 3 days from now. He is not looking for justice. He is looking to clean the house." Eliza looked at the old man. "Why are you telling me this? Eli, if Rourke knew—" "I have delivered mail in this territory for 20 years, Eli said, spitting on the ground. "I have seen good men die and bad men get rich, but I never saw a man try to start a war just to water his cows. It ain't right." That night, Eliza showed the ledger scrap to Colin. He studied it, though he could not read the words. Eliza explained what it meant. "They lie to kill," Colin said, his face grim. "We need the truth." "This scrap is not enough," Eliza said. "It is just paper. We need a witness, someone who knows where you were when the wagon was attacked. You said you were delivering medicine." Kalin nodded. "To my aunt, Nali. She lives in the Canyon of Whispers, 2 hours' ride. We go to her," Eliza decided. "If she can testify, if she can speak to the federal magistrate when he comes through next month." "She speaks little English," Kalin warned. "But she speaks the truth." They left before dawn, riding under the cover of a waning moon. Eliza rode Bess. Cullen ran alongside until they were well clear of the valley. Then he doubled up behind her on the mare. The physical closeness was necessary, but it sent a confusing heat through Eliza's back where his chest pressed against her. The Canyon of Whispers was a narrow slash in the earth, hidden by twisting juniper and red rock towers. Nali lived in a small shelter built into the cliff face, almost invisible until one was right upon it. She was an ancient woman, her face a map of wrinkles that told 1,000 stories. She looked at Eliza with sharp, obsidian eyes, then looked at Kalin. She spoke in a rapid, fluid tongue that sounded like wind moving through dry leaves. Colin answered her, his voice respectful. He gestured to Eliza, then to his side where the wound was healing. Nali nodded. She reached into a woven basket and pulled out a small pouch. She opened it, showing Eliza the dried herbs inside. "Medicine," Nali said, the English word heavy on her tongue. "He brings for the coughing sickness." She pointed to the sky. "Sun high, wagon burn, sun low." Eliza understood. The wagon was attacked at noon. Kalin had been here, delivering medicine, until sunset. He had an alibi, a solid, unbreakable alibi. "Will you tell this to the white chief?" Eliza asked, miming a judge with a gavel. Nali looked at Colin. He nodded. "I speak," Nali said. It was a small victory, but it felt massive. They had the truth. Now they just had to survive long enough to tell it. The return to the cabin was tense. As they neared the homestead, they saw a horse tethered to the porch rail, A fine black thoroughbred. Barlow, Eliza whispered. Stay back, she told Kaelin. Stay in the trees. If he sees you, he will shoot. Kaelin hesitated, his hand on his knife. I watch. Eliza rode into the yard alone. Silas Barlow was sitting on her porch bench, smoking a cigar. He looked entirely at ease, like a man who owned everything his eyes touched. Miss Hart, he said, not standing up. You have been out for a ride. Lovely country, isn't it? What do you want, Mr. Barlow? Eliza asked, dismounting. She kept best between herself and the man. I came to invite you to town, Barlow said, flicking ash onto her clean floorboards. Tomorrow. I have the papers drawn up. Transfer of deed. I have increased the offer to $600. It is a fortune. I told you, Eliza said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. I am not selling. Barlow stood up. The pleasant mask dropped. His face became hard, the eyes of a predator. Eliza, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You are playing a game you do not understand. You think because you built a cabin, you are a pioneer. You are a nuisance, and nuisances get removed. He stepped off the porch, walking toward her. Eliza put her hand on the revolver at her hip. Barlow laughed. Go ahead, he said. Shoot an unarmed man on your own land. See how that plays with the sheriff. He stopped 3 feet from her. He smelled of expensive tobacco and cruelty. A young woman, living alone. Accidents are so easy, he murmured. A lantern gets knocked over in the night. A horse spooks and tramples its owner. A stray bullet from an Indian raid finds a soft target. He leaned in closer. Sign the papers, Eliza, or by next week there won't be a hand left to hold a pen. He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Eliza stood there, the threat hanging in the air like smoke. She felt small. She felt fragile. Kaelin emerged from the trees. He had heard. He looked at Barlow's retreating dust, then at Eliza. He does not fear, Kaelin said. Because he thinks you are sheep. I am not a sheep, Eliza said, wiping a tear of frustration from her cheek. Then stop acting like prey. Kaelin said, Come, I teach. The next 2 days were a transformation. The cabin ceased to be a home and became a training ground. Kaelin took her into the woods. He stripped away the civilized layers of her Missouri upbringing and taught her the language of the wild. You walk loud, he told her. You break sticks. You announce yourself. He taught her to walk, rolling her foot from the outside edge to the inside, feeling the ground before committing her weight. He taught her to breathe through her nose, silently, to keep her scent close. He taught her to read the wind. Wind brings news, he said, tossing a handful of dry grass into the air. If the wind hits your back, the deer smells you, the enemy smells you. He taught her to look not at the whole forest, but at the breaks in the pattern. A bird flying up suddenly meant movement. A silence in the crickets meant danger. Eliza was a quick study. She was fueled by fear and anger, a potent mixture. Her hands, once blistered from the building, now became adept at moving unseen. She learned to freeze instantly. She learned to blend into the shadows. It was an intimacy of a different kind. Kaelin did not touch her with romance, but he corrected her posture, adjusted her grip on the rifle, guided her movements. His hands were firm, professional, yet every touch sent a jolt through her. She was learning to trust him with her life. On the night before the sheriff's scheduled sweep, the danger arrived early. They were near the ridge, scouting. When Kaelin signaled for a halt, he dropped to a crouch, pulling Eliza down with him. Below them, in the twilight, a group of 5 riders was moving up the creek bed. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Skinner and 4 hired guns. They were not riding in formation. They were spread out, rifles across their saddles. They were hunting. They cut off the cabin, Colin whispered. We cannot go back. Where do we go? Eliza asked. The temperature was dropping fast. The desert night was approaching. And she had no coat, only her shawl. The rocks, Kaelin said. He led her up the steep slope, away from the water, into a labyrinth of sandstone boulders. They climbed until Eliza's lungs burned and her fingers were raw. Finally, Kalen squeezed through a narrow fissure into a small, shallow cave protected by an overhang. It was invisible from below, but it was cold. The stone held the chill of the coming winter. They sat in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside. Skinner's men were camping down by the creek. Eliza could see the faint glow of their fire. They were cutting her off from her home, her food, her warmth. Eliza shivered. It started as a tremble in her hands and spread to her whole body. Her teeth began to chatter. "You are cold," Colin said. I'm fine," Eliza stuttered. "Lies kill," Colin said gently. He unrolled the heavy wool serape he wore over his shoulder. He moved next to her. "Come," he said. Eliza hesitated for only a second. The cold was a physical pain. She shifted closer to him. Kalen wrapped the serape around both of them, pulling her into the shelter of his body. He sat with his back against the stone wall. His legs stretched out. Eliza sat between his legs, her back resting against his chest. The heat was instantaneous. He was like a furnace. Eliza stiffened at first, overwhelmed by the proximity. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart against her back. She could feel the rise and fall of his breath. His arms were outside the blanket, one hand resting on his knee, the other near the knife at his belt. He was not holding her. He was shielding her. Slowly, the tension left her body. She leaned back, accepting his warmth. "They will burn the cabin," Eliza whispered into the darkness. "If they don't find us, they will burn it." "Logs are wood," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "Wood grows back. You do not—" "I work so hard for it," she said, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I know," Kalen said. He shifted slightly, and his arm brushed against her shoulder. He did not pull away. Instead, he adjusted the blanket, tucking it tighter around her neck. His hand lingered for a moment on her shoulder. It was not a sexual touch. It was something far more dangerous. It was the touch of a man who had claimed responsibility for her safety. Eliza turned her head slightly. His face was inches away in the gloom. She could see the strong line of his jaw, the stoic set of his mouth. "Colin," she whispered. He looked down at her. His eyes were unguarded for the first time. In them, she saw a reflection of her own confusion and longing. "Sleep," he said softly. "I watch." Eliza closed her eyes, but sleep was miles away. She was acutely aware of every inch of him, the roughness of his buckskin shirt, the smell of sage and man, the solid, unyielding strength of him behind her. She realized then that the indecency the town whispered about was not what she was feeling. What she felt was not dirty. It was the only clean thing in a world full of mud and lies. It was the feeling of being anchored in a storm. She reached out from under the blanket and found his hand, the one resting on his knee. She laced her fingers through his. Kalen went still. He did not squeeze back, but he did not pull away. He let her hold his hand, in the silence of the cave, with the killers waiting below and the cold wind screaming outside. Eliza's heart fell asleep holding the hand of the enemy. For the first time in her 22 years, she felt completely and utterly safe, but safety was an illusion. Tomorrow, the sun will rise, and with it, the fire. They had the truth, and they had each other. But Barlow had the guns. The rising action was over. The climax was about to begin. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It brought a reckoning. The air in the valley was brittle, tight as a drum skin waiting for the mallet to strike. Eliza Hart stood on the porch of the cabin she had built with her own bleeding hands. She was not hiding in the cave any longer. She and Colin had agreed running was an admission of guilt, and hiding was a slow death. They would stand. Colin was inside, out of sight, but his presence was a tangible weight against the back of the door. Eliza smoothed her apron. Beneath the cotton fabric, the heavy Colt Navy revolver pressed against her hip bone. They came from the east, a cloud of dust signaling their intent long before the sound of hoofbeats reached the yard. It was not a small party. Sheriff Rourke rode in front, his face grim and set. Beside him was Silas Barlow, dressed in a suit that cost more than Eliza's entire homestead. Behind them rode Skinner and 6 other hired guns, deputized for the occasion. But trailing further back, in a ragtag procession of wagons and buggies, were the townspeople of Pine Mesa. Eli Briggs drove his stagecoach, and beside him sat Martha O'Rourke, her face pale but determined. The procession halted at the fence line. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the snort of a horse and the creak of leather. Sheriff Rourke dismounted. He walked to the gate, unlatched it, and stepped into the yard. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "Eliza Hart," Rourke announced, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "I have a warrant here for your arrest." Eliza did not flinch. "On what charges?" "Sheriff, harboring a fugitive, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to incite violence against the territory." Rourke folded the paper. "Step down from the porch. Miss Hart, do not make this difficult." "I am on my own land," Eliza said, her voice steady, though her knees trembled. "And I've committed no crime. Saving a dying man is not a conspiracy. It is Christianity. Or have you forgotten your Bible?" "Sheriff," Barlow laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "She preaches to us." "Rourke, a woman who sleeps with savages preaches to us." Barlow turned to the crowd behind him, raising his voice. "Look at her, standing there defiant. She has let a Navajo wolf into her bed, and together they plot the raid on the supply wagons. She gave them the schedule. She told them when to strike." A murmur went through the crowd. Some looked angry, but others looked uncertain. Eli Briggs stood up in his wagon seat. "That is a lie. Silas Barlow," Eli shouted. "And you know it." "Quiet, the old fool," Barlow snapped at Skinner. Skinner spurred his horse forward, cutting off Eli. Rourke marched up the steps to the porch. "Enough talk. Miss Hart, you are coming with me. If the Indian is inside, tell him to come out, or we will burn him out." Rourke reached for Eliza's arm. His grip was hard, bruising. He yanked her forward, off balance. "Get your hands off me," Eliza cried, struggling. "You are coming to jail." Rourke growled. Suddenly, the cabin door flew open. "Let her go." The voice was not loud, but it stopped every motion in the yard. Kalen stepped out onto the porch. He was not holding a weapon. His rifle leaned against the doorframe behind him. His hands were open, held out at his sides, palms showing. He wore his buckskin shirt and the trousers Eliza had mended. He looked not like a savage, but like a king in exile. Rourke released Eliza, stepping back, his hand dropping to his holster. "There he is, the dog." "I am the one you want," Kalen said, his English slow and deliberate. "She did nothing but heal a wound. I surrender." He walked down the steps, moving past Eliza, placing himself between her and the guns. He went to his knees in the dust, interlacing his fingers behind his head. It was an act of supreme submission, designed to remove any excuse for violence. Barlow's face twisted in frustration. He had wanted a fight. He had wanted an excuse to shoot them both in the confusion. A surrender ruined the narrative. "He is tricking you," Barlow shouted. "He has a knife in his boot. Shoot him." "Skinner, he is reaching for a weapon." Skinner raised his Winchester. "No!" Eliza screamed. She dove between Skinner's rifle and Kalen, shielding his body with her own. She ripped the folded paper, the charred bill of lading, from her pocket and held it high. "Stop!" she yelled, her voice cracking with desperation. "Look at this, look at it." She turned to the crowd, to the townspeople who were watching with wide eyes. "Barlow says the Navajo raided his wagons. He says they stole the rifles. But this is a bill of lading signed by Silas Barlow 2 days before the raid." She waved the paper. It lists the rifles as received and stored at the Double Bar North Barn. He never put them on the wagon. He shipped empty crates, burned them himself, and blamed the Navajo so he could bring the militia in to clear this valley. "She is lying," Barlow roared, his face turning a mottled red. "That paper is a forgery." "Is the bullet hole a forgery?" Eliza shouted back. She pointed to the wagon wheel of the sheriff's buggy. "Skinner shot Kalen. I dug the slug out of the wall of my cabin where it lodged. It is a .45 caliber slug from a Henry rifle. The Navajo use arrows or trade muskets. Only Barlow's men carry Henry repeaters." She reached into her pocket and threw the flattened lead slug onto the porch steps. It rang with a dull clink. "And I have a witness," Eliza pointed to Eli. Eli Briggs saw the driver confess, and Nolly, the medicine woman, will testify that Colin was delivering herbs to her when the raid happened. He was 20 miles away. The truth hung in the air, stark and undeniable. The crowd began to mutter louder this time. "Is that true? Sheriff," a man from the back called out. "Did Barlow fake the raid? We ain't here to kill folks for water rights." "Rourke," another voice shouted. Rourke looked at Barlow. The sheriff's eyes darted around. He saw the doubt in the crowd. He saw the loss of control. Barlow saw it too. He realized the legal path was closing. The deception had failed. All that was left was brute force. "Shut up!" Barlow screamed. "All of you, this is my valley. I bought the law in this county, and I will not let a whore and a savage take my water." He turned to Skinner. "Burn it. Burn it all. Destroy the evidence. Kill them." "No!" Martha O'Rourke screamed. She jumped from the wagon, running toward the gate. Skinner didn't hesitate. He lit a rag-wrapped stick he had prepared and threw it. It wasn't aimed at the people. It was aimed at the cabin roof. The dry cedar shakes, cured by months of desert sun, caught fire instantly. The flame licked up the wood, eager and hungry. "Fire!" someone shouted. Chaos erupted. Kalen moved instantly. He didn't stay on his knees. He surged upward, grabbing Eliza and pulling her off the porch just as a second torch landed where they had been standing. "Run!" Kalen commanded. Skinner leveled his rifle. "Get them!" A gunshot cracked. It wasn't Skinner. It was Eliza. She had drawn her Colt and fired into the dirt at Skinner's horse's feet. The horse reared. Throwing Skinner's aim off, his bullet went wild, shattering a window. "To the creek!" Colin yelled. They sprinted toward the side of the cabin, heading for the cover of the tree line and the creek bed. "Cut them down!" Barlow was screaming, drawing his own pearl-handled pistol. He fired blindly into the smoke that was now billowing from the roof. Sheriff Rourke stood frozen for a second. He looked at the burning cabin, then at Barlow. He made a choice. He raised his shotgun. "Stop them," Rourke ordered his deputies. The yard dissolved into a melee. The townspeople were scrambling to get their wagons away from the shooting. Eli Briggs was trying to control his mules. Martha O'Rourke ran straight at her brother-in-law. Grabbing the barrel of his shotgun, "Patrick, don't you do this!" Martha screamed at the sheriff. "He is an innocent man." Rourke shoved her aside. Roughly. "Go home, Martha," he fired. The buckshot tore through the leaves of the oak tree. Eliza and Kalen were passing. Eliza felt a sudden, sharp sting in her upper left arm, like a bee sting magnified 100 times. She stumbled, gasping. "Eliza?" Kalen caught her before she fell. "I am hit," she gasped. She looked at her sleeve. A dark stain was spreading rapidly on the gray fabric. "Move," Colin said, his voice tight. He didn't panic. He threw his arm around her waist, half carrying her. They reached the drainage ditch. Eliza had dug the ditch Colin had finished. It offered a shallow trench of cover. They dropped into it, mud and water soaking their clothes. Behind them, the cabin was roaring. The heat was intense, a physical wall pressing against their backs. The home Eliza had built log by log, the symbol of her independence, was turning into a funeral pyre. From the ditch, Eliza raised her head. She saw Barlow and his men advancing, using the smoke as cover. They were coming to finish it. "We cannot stay here," Kalen said. "They will flank us." "The evidence," Eliza choked out. "The paper." "I have it," Colin said. He patted his chest. He had snatched it from her hand when they fell. Suddenly, a rider broke from the group of townspeople. It was Eli Briggs, whipping his mules. He drove the stagecoach right between Barlow's men and the ditch, creating a moving barricade. "Get to the rocks," Eli shouted over the roar of the fire. Bullets splintered the wood of the stagecoach. Eli ducked low. Kalen didn't waste the chance. "Come," he hauled Eliza up. They scrambled out of the ditch and into the thick brush of the creek bed. The willows whipped their faces. The mud sucked at their boots. They ran until her lungs burned, until the sounds of the shouting faded into the distance, replaced by the ominous crackle of the great fire behind them. They reached a cluster of boulders at the base of the canyon wall. Kalin pulled her behind a slab of sandstone. He immediately checked her arm. "The bone is safe," he said, pressing his thumb against the wound to check the bleeding. "Through the flesh. Clean." Eliza leaned her head back against the rock, fighting the dizziness. She looked back toward the homestead. A pillar of black smoke punched a hole in the blue sky. Through the haze, she could see the roof of her cabin collapse in a shower of sparks. Everything she owned, her mother's quilt, her books, her seeds for the spring, gone. She felt a sob rise in her throat, but she choked it down. Down in the valley, the shooting had stopped. The fire had done its work, separating the combatants. Sheriff Rourke stood near the gate, watching the flames. His deputy, a young man named Miller, stood beside him, his pistol hanging limp in his hand. "We should pursue them, Sheriff," Barlow said, walking up. He was panting, his fine suit covered in dust. "They cannot have gone far. The girl is wounded." Rourke looked at the townspeople. They had stopped fleeing. They were standing in a semicircle, watching the sheriff, watching the fire. Their faces were not fearful anymore. They were judging. "We wait," Rourke said. "Wait," Barlow hissed. "I pay you to act." "Rourke, you paid me to enforce the law," Rourke said, his voice low. "Not to massacre a woman in front of the whole town. Look at them. Silas, you lost them." Barlow looked at the crowd. He saw the anger. He saw Eli Briggs holding a rifle across his lap. He saw the way the men were looking at the burning cabin, a violation of the sacred code of the West. You do not burn a man's home. Deputy Miller holstered his gun. "I am done, Sheriff," the young man said quietly. "What did you say?" Rourke demanded. "I said I am done," Miller repeated, taking the tin star off his vest. "I didn't sign up for this. That girl, she had the proof, and you shot at her anyway." Miller dropped the star in the dust and walked away toward his horse. It was a small gesture, but it cracked the foundation of Rourke's authority. Back in the rocks, Eliza watched the smoke. The pain in her arm was a throbbing pulse. Kalin was tearing a strip from his own shirt to bind her wound. "It is gone," Kalin said softly. "The cabin." Eliza looked at him. His face was streaked with soot and blood. He had risked everything, his freedom, his life, to walk out onto that porch for her. She looked at the fire. It was destruction. Yes, but it was also a cleansing. The cabin had been her fortress against the world, but it had also been her cage. She had been trying to be a homesteader, playing by the rules of a society that didn't want her. Now, the rules were burned. She reached out and took Kalin's hand. His grip was iron strong. "I do not belong to their fear," Eliza said. Her voice was hoarse from the smoke, but it had a steel core that hadn't been there before. "Let them burn the logs. They cannot burn what we know." Kalin looked at her. The admiration in his eyes was fierce. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her soot-stained knuckles, a gesture of reverence. Not just romance. "No," he said. "They cannot." He stood up, pulling her gently to her feet. "We go to the high canyon, to Nali. There. We are ghosts. They cannot find ghosts." Eliza looked one last time at the pyre of her past life. Then she turned her back on it. She adjusted the holster at her hip. She ignored the pain in her arm. They began the climb up the narrow deer trail, moving higher, away from the smoke, away from the lies of Pine Mesa. They had lost the house. They had lost the land, for now. But as they climbed into the vast, open silence of the mountains, Eliza realized they had kept the only thing that mattered. They were free, and they were together. The fever came upon Eliza not like a thief in the night, but like a hammer blow in the heat of the day. The adrenaline that had carried her through the burning of her cabin and the desperate scramble up the canyon walls had finally evaporated, leaving behind only the throbbing ache in her arm and a chilling fire in her blood. They were holed up in a shallow depression of rock known to the Navajo as the Owl's Eye, a natural alcove high above the valley floor, shielded from the wind by twisting juniper roots and ancient sandstone. It was a place where a person could vanish. Eliza lay on a bed of pine boughs in the heavy wool serape Colin had spread for her. Her skin was burning, dry and papery to the touch. In her delirium, she was not in a cave in New Mexico territory. She was back in the cabin, but the cabin was whole, and she was trying to scrub soot off the walls, but the soot kept turning into blood. "The roof," she mumbled, thrashing her head against the saddlebag that served as her pillow. "The roof is falling. The water is black." Kalen sat beside her, his face etched with a worry that he allowed no one else to see. He had become the healer. The roles had reversed with a symmetry that fate seemed to enjoy. Weeks ago, she had dug a bullet out of his side. Now, he was fighting the infection that sought to claim her arm. He worked with the quiet efficiency of his people. He had ventured out at dusk, risking discovery to gather the prickly pear cactus pads and the leaves of the globe mallow. He had peeled the cactus, scraping away the spines, and mashed the pulp into a wet, cool poultice. "Drink," Kalen said softly, lifting her head with one hand while holding a tin cup to her lips with the other. Eliza choked, pushing the water away. "No, no time. The timber. I have to pay for the timber." "The timber is paid for," Kalen soothed her, his voice a low rumble that cut through the haze of her fever. "Rest now, Eliza." He bathed her forehead with a rag dipped in the cool water he had carried up from a hidden seep in the rocks. He cleaned the wound on her arm, his large, calloused hands moving with a tenderness that belied their strength. He sang softly, a chant without words, a rhythm that was meant to slow the racing heart and cool the blood. For 2 days, the world was nothing but shadows and heat for Eliza. She cried out for her father. She cried out for the cabin. She wept for the quilt her mother had stitched, now nothing but ash on the valley floor. "It is gone," she sobbed in a moment of lucidity, tears tracking through the dust on her face. "Everything I built, every hour of sweat, gone." Kalen squeezed the water from the rag and placed it gently on her neck. He looked her in the eye, his gaze intense and grounding. "Wood burns," he said simply. "Mud crumbles. A house can be built again. I can cut the trees. I can mix the mud. But a person," he touched her cheek with the back of his knuckles, "a person cannot be built again. You are the fire, Eliza. The cabin was just the hearth." His words settled into her, anchoring her drifting spirit. She looked at him, really looked at him through the haze. He looked exhausted. His eyes were red-rimmed, his buckskin shirt stained with travel and caretaking. He had not slept. He had stood guard over her life while his own was forfeit in the town below. By the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Eliza woke to the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. She felt weak, as if her bones had been hollowed out. But the world was sharp and clear again. The pain in her arm had dulled to a manageable ache. She sat up, clutching the serape to her chest. Kalen was crouched by a small, smokeless fire near the cave entrance, turning a rabbit on a spit. He sensed her movement and turned. A rare, genuine smile touched his lips. "You are back," he said. "I am back," Eliza whispered. Her throat was dry. "Eat," he said, bringing her a portion of the meat on a flat stone. "Then we move. The wind brings news." "What news?" "Skinner," Kalen said, the name sounding like a curse. "He tracks. He found the blood by the creek. He is close." Eliza ate the rabbit with ravenous hunger. Strength flowed back into her limbs. "We need to get the ledger to Judge Black," she said. "Eli told me the circuit judge is due at the Seven Springs way station tomorrow. If we miss him, he moves on to Tucson, and we lose our chance." "Seven Springs is a hard ride," Kalen said. "Through the Red Gorge. We have to try," Eliza said. She stood up, swaying slightly. Kalen was at her side instantly, steadying her. "I can ride. I have to ride." They packed their meager belonging. The ledger, the charred piece of paper that proved Barlow's guilt, was wrapped in oilskin and tucked securely inside Callan's shirt, against his heart. The journey to Seven Springs was a gauntlet thrown down by the land itself. The Red Gorge was a narrow, twisting scar in the earth, filled with loose shale and choking red dust. The sun beat down on them, relentless and cruel. They had only one horse, Bess, Eliza's mare, who had miraculously followed them partway up the canyon and whom Callan had retrieved. They took turns riding, but as the terrain grew steeper, they both walked, leading the mare. It was noon when the conflict shifted from man against nature to man against man. A gunshot echoed off the canyon walls, the sound bouncing a dozen times so it was impossible to tell the source. Rock sprayed near Callan's boot. "High ground!" Callan shouted, shoving Eliza behind a boulder. Skinner and 3 men had cut the trail. They were positioned on the opposite ridge, firing down into the gorge. They didn't care about capture anymore. They were shooting to kill. "Pin them down," Skinner's voice drifted across the gap. "Don't let them reach the pass." Eliza drew her revolver. She rested her good arm on the rock and fired back. The heavy recoil jarred her injured shoulder, but she gritted her teeth. "I am not dying in a ditch. Skinner," she yelled. "Save your powder," Callan warned. "We run." They moved in a crouch, using the falling rock and the scrub oak for cover. It was a desperate scramble. Dust clogged their noses. Loose stones skittered under their boots, threatening to send them tumbling hundreds of feet to the dry riverbed below. Bess snorted and tossed her head, her eyes rolling with fear. But she followed Callan's firm hand on the reins. They were trapped. The ridge ahead was exposed. If they crossed it, they would be targets on a shooting range. Then, from the valley floor far below, a distraction arrived. A wagon appeared on the lower trail, moving slowly. It was Eli Briggs. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be on his mail route. But suddenly, the wagon jackknifed, blocking the narrow trail that Skinner's men would need to descend to cross the canyon. Eli stood up on the seat, shouting and waving his hat, creating a commotion that drew the eye. Bear on the trail," he yelled, though there was no bear. Skinner, distracted, turned his glass toward the wagon. "Move that wreck, old man," he screamed, in that brief window of distraction. Callan grabbed Eliza's hand. "Now!" They broke cover, sprinting across the shale slide. Bullets kicked up red puffs of dust at their heels, whining like angry hornets. Eliza's lungs burned. Her legs felt like lead, but she didn't stop. She focused on Cullen's back, on the black hair streaming in the wind. They crested the ridge and dropped down the other side, sliding uncontrollably down a slope of loose gravel until they hit the solid ground of a dry wash. They were out of the line of fire. "Eli," Eliza gasped, bracing her hands on her knees. "He blocked them." "He bought time," Callan said, checking the mare's legs. "We use it." But they were not safe yet. Skinner would find a way around. As they moved through a narrow slot canyon, they found signs of another ally. A branch of sagebrush had been swept across the rocky ground, obliterating hoofprints. A small pile of stones was arranged in a specific marker, a Navajo sign for water ahead. "Stay left." "Nali?" Callan whispered, touching the stones. "She ghosts them. She leads them to the box canyon." Eliza felt a surge of gratitude that brought fresh tears to her eyes. They were not alone. The web of people, Martha, Eli. Nali was holding tight and strong, against the weight of Barlow's money. They reached the Seven Springs way station at dusk. It was a crude adobe structure sitting near a cluster of cottonwoods. Several horses were tethered outside, including a fine gray gelding with a government brand. Judge Thaddeus Black was eating a plate of beans when the door burst open. He was a man of 60, with a face like a dried apple and eyes that had seen every variation of human sin. Eliza and Callan stood in the doorway. They looked like apparitions. They were covered in red dust, their clothes torn, dried blood on Eliza's sleeve. Callan stood tall, his presence filling the room, yet he made no move to threaten. "Judge Black?" Eliza asked, her voice raspy. "I am," the judge said, putting down his spoon. "And who, might I ask, are you?" "I am Eliza Hart, and this She gestured to Kalen. Is the man Silas Barlow is trying to frame for robbery and murder? She walked to the table and slammed the oilskin packet down. She unwrapped it with trembling fingers, revealing the charred ledger page and the flattened bullet. We have evidence, she said, and we are done running. For an hour, the way station was a court of law. Judge Black examined the ledger. He examined the bullet. He listened to Eliza's testimony. He listened to Kalen's translated account of his whereabouts, corroborated by the affidavit Eliza had scribbled down from Nolly's words. The judge leaned back in his chair. He lit a pipe. Silas Barlow is a powerful man, the judge said quietly. He has friends in Santa Fe. Does he have friends in Washington? Eliza asked pointedly. Because stealing federal mail, even if he burned it himself, is a federal crime, and framing a man to incite an Indian war, that is treason against the peace of the territory. The judge looked at Eliza. He saw the steel in her spine. He looked at Kalen, who stood silently by the window, watching the darkness. I will issue a federal warrant, the judge said. But I have no marshals here, just my clerk. We don't need marshals, Kalen said, turning from the window. We need the paper. The paper makes the sheriff small. They camped that night a mile from the way station, in a secluded grove of aspen trees. The judge had offered them a room, but they refused. Walls felt like traps now. The danger was still out there. Skinner was likely still hunting, but having the warrant in Eliza's pocket changed the weight of the air. It was no longer a desperate flight. It was a tactical pause. The moon was full, bathing the white bark of the aspens in a ghostly silver light. Eliza sat by the small fire, cleaning her gun. Kalen was sharpening his knife. The domesticity of the violence was strange, yet comforting. Eliza looked at him. The firelight danced on the planes of his face, softening the harsh angles. He looked up and caught her gaze. The arm, he asked. It hurts, she admitted. But it hurts a lot. It reminds me I am alive. She put the gun down. She stood up and walked around the fire to where he sat. She didn't stop until she was standing right in front of him. Kalen looked up. His hand stilled on the knife. He did not move away, but he did not reach for her. He waited. He always waited for her to choose. Eliza dropped to her knees in the soft grass beside him. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the roughness of his skin. You could have left, she whispered. That day at the cabin, you could have walked away and saved yourself. No, Kalen said. I could not. Why? Because, Kalen said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper, a man does not leave his heart in a burning house. Eliza's breath hitched. The admission hung in the air, stark and beautiful. She leaned in. It was a slow movement, giving him every second to pull away, to reject her, to retreat into the safety of their defined roles. But he didn't move. He watched her lips, his eyes darkening. She closed the distance. Her lips brushed his tentative at first, a question asked in the dark. And then he answered. He dropped the knife. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers threading into her tangled hair. He kissed her back, not with the hunger of a starving man, but with the reverence of a man discovering a new religion. His mouth was warm, firm, and tasted of the wild. It was a kiss that contained everything they had survived. The smoke, the blood, the fear, and the silence. Eliza made a sound in her throat, a soft whimpering of need she hadn't known she possessed. She pressed closer, her body seeking the solid heat of him. She felt the heavy beat of his heart against her chest. For a moment, the kiss deepened. His hand slid down her back, pulling her waist against his. The friction was electric. Eliza felt a rush of desire that was entirely new to her, a heat that centered low in her belly and radiated outward, making her fingertips tingle. She realized, with a shock, that she wanted this. She wanted him. She wanted to strip away the buckskin and the cotton and feel skin against skin. But Kalen pulled back. He did not push her away. He simply broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers. His breathing was ragged. His hands on her arms were trembling slightly with the effort of restraint. "Eliza," he groaned, his voice rough. "We stop." "I don't want to stop," she whispered, her eyes closed, her hands clutching his shirt. I have never belonged to anyone. Cullen, I have never wanted to, but I look at you, and I feel like I am finally home." Cullen took a deep breath, fighting the urge to pull her back down into the grass. He pulled back enough to look into her eyes. "You do not belong to me," he said firmly, "and I do not occupy you like land. I do not want to take you because you are grateful, or because you are scared, or because the fire makes the blood hot." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I want you to choose me when the sun is high, when there are no guns, when you are safe. Then, if you come to me, then I will never let you go." Eliza looked at him, feeling a wave of love so intense it almost knocked the wind out of her. He was giving her the one thing no man in her life, not her father, not Barlow, not the suitors in Missouri had ever given her, complete agency. "I have chosen," she said clearly. "But I understand." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her in a protective embrace that was more intimate than any act of passion could have been. "We're going back tomorrow," she said into the silence. "Yes," Kalen agreed. "We don't run anymore. No more running. We take the warrant to Rourke. We take the land back." "And if Barlow fights?" Kalen asked. Eliza pulled back. She picked up her revolver from where she had left it. The firelight glinted on the cold steel barrel. "Then we finish it," she said. "I am done being the victim. I am done being the girl in the cabin." Kalen nodded, a fierce pride burning in his eyes. "Good, because the wolf does not run from the dog." They sat by the fire as it burned down to embers. Two outcasts forging a new kind of alliance. They were no longer just surviving the falling action. They were preparing to write the resolution. They would return to Pine Mesa not as fugitives, but as the storm that follows the drought. The night was cold, but Eliza Hart was no longer afraid of the dark. She had found the fire, and she carried it within her now. The return to Pine Mesa was not a parade, nor was it an ambush. It was a procession of two, riding down the main street at high noon, casting long shadows against the whitewashed storefronts. Eliza sat tall in the saddle of her mare, her left arm in a sling, her face scrubbed clean of the red dust of the canyon, but still bearing the grim set of a woman who had walked through fire. Behind her, riding the gray gelding borrowed from the Seven Springs way station, was Kalen. He did not ride with his head down. He rode with the straight back of a warrior who had nothing left to hide. The town went quiet. The blacksmith's hammer stopped ringing. The door to the saloon swung open, and men drifted out, blinking in the harsh sunlight. They had seen the smoke of the burning cabin. They had heard the gunshots. They had assumed the woman and the Navajo were dead or fleeing to Mexico. To see them riding back into the heart of the beast was a shock that froze the air in their lungs. Sheriff Rourke was sitting on the boardwalk outside his office, whittling a stick. When he saw them, the knife slipped, slicing into the wood. He stood up slowly, brushing the shavings from his trousers. Down the street, Silas Barlow emerged from the bank, looking impeccable in a fresh suit, though his eyes were darting nervously toward the sudden silence. Eliza reined in her horse directly in front of the sheriff's office. She did not dismount. She reached into her saddlebag with her good hand and pulled out a document sealed with the heavy red wax of the Federal District Court. "Sheriff Rourke," Eliza said, her voice carrying clear and cold to every ear on the street. "I believe you have been looking for us." Rourke stepped into the street, his hand hovering near his gun. "You are under arrest, Miss Hart, and that savage is to be clapped in irons immediately." "I don't think so," Eliza said. She tossed the document. It fluttered through the air and landed in the dust at Rourke's boots. "That is a federal warrant issued by Judge Thaddeus Black this morning. It calls for the immediate arrest of Silas Barlow for the theft of federal property, fraud, and incitement of insurrection. It also names you, Patrick Rourke, as a co-conspirator and orders your immediate suspension pending a territorial inquiry." Barlow laughed, pushing his way through the gathering crowd. A piece of paper. You think a piece of paper stops me? I own this town. Little girl. You own the fear, Kalen spoke up. His voice was deep, resonant, and perfectly calm. But the fear is gone. Barlow turned purple. Skinner. Where is Skinner? Arrest them. But Skinner did not appear. The foreman had seen the federal seal from the alleyway and had decided that his wages did not cover hanging for treason. He was already riding north, putting miles between himself and the Double Bar Ranch. Skinner is gone! Silas! Eli Briggs shouted from the seat of his stagecoach parked near the general store. And so is your luck. Eli climbed down, holding a shotgun, not aiming it, just holding it comfortably. Beside him, Deputy Miller stepped out of the sheriff's office. Miller was no longer wearing his badge, but he was holding a ring of keys. The jail is empty, Sheriff, Miller said to Rourke, but I reckon we have room for two. Rourke looked at the warrant in the dirt. He looked at Miller. He looked at the crowd. The faces that had once turned away from Eliza in shame were now looking at him with open hostility. They knew about the burnt wagon. They knew about the lies. Rourke was a bully. And like all bullies, he crumbled when the power dynamic shifted. He slowly unbuckled his gun belt and let it drop to the ground. I was just following orders, Rourke muttered. The eternal excuse of the weak. Barlow was not so easily cowed. He drew a derringer from his vest pocket, a coward's gun. I will not be ruined by a whore and The crack of a rifle cut him off. Barlow yelped, dropping the small pistol as dust kicked up inches from his polished boot. Kalen sat on his horse, his rifle smoking slightly. He hadn't shot Barlow. He had shot the ground. A warning shot of impossible precision. The next one takes the ear, Kalen said. Two burly men from the blacksmith shop stepped forward. Grabbing Barlow by the arms, the spell was broken. The town of Pine Mesa, tired of being ruled by a man who would burn a neighbor's home for water, finally exhaled. Justice in the West was often messy, but today it was swift. Rourke and Barlow were marched into the very cells they had kept for drunks and rustlers. It was over. The tyranny of the Double Bar Ranch had ended not with a massacre, but with the heavy, undeniable weight of the truth. 3 weeks later, the valley was quiet again. The scars of the fire were still there, a blackened square of earth where the cabin had stood, the charred skeletons of the oak trees nearby. But green shoots were already pushing up through the ash. The earth was forgiving. Eliza stood by the spring. The water was running clear again, the mud from the cattle having long since washed away. A government surveyor had come and gone, confirming her claim and marking the boundaries with fresh stone cairns. The deed was hers, indisputable and safe. But as she looked at the empty space where her life used to be, she felt a strange lack of grief. Kalen came up behind her. He was carrying a bundle of willow saplings. He stopped, sensing her mood. We can start the foundation tomorrow, he said. Stone this time. The river rocks are strong. Eliza turned to him. Do we build it here? Colin looked at the blackened ground. The ghosts of the fire are here. Bad dreams sleep in the ash. He pointed to a rise further up the slope, closer to the tree line, where the view of the valley opened up like the palm of a hand. There, the wind is cleaner, and you can see who comes. We, Eliza said, correcting him softly. We, Kalen agreed. I don't want a fortress. Colin, Eliza said, stepping closer to him. I built the last one to keep the world out. I wanted to prove I didn't need anyone. I wanted to be an island. And now, Eliza smiled, reaching out to take his hand. I want a home. I want a door that opens. I want a table with 2 chairs. I want freedom, but I want to share it. Kalen squeezed her hand. Then we build a home. The construction of the new cabin was different. It was not a desperate race against winter. It was a labor of love. They worked side by side. Kalen hauled the heavy river stones, his muscles moving like oiled ropes under his skin. Eliza mixed the mortar. Her arm healed enough to work, though she tired easily. They did not work in isolation. Eli Briggs came by on his days off, bringing nails and gossip. Martha O'Rourke, now running the general store since her husband had left town in shame alongside his brother, sent bolts of calico and jars of preserved peaches. Even the young deputy, Miller, rode out once to help lift the heavy ridgepole. The town was changing. It was slow, like the turning of a heavy wheel. There were still people who crossed the street when they saw Colin. There were still whispers in the church pews about the white woman living in sin. But the venom was gone. The fear that Barlow had manufactured had evaporated, leaving behind a grudging respect. Eliza Hart and the Navajo warrior had stood their ground. And in the West, standing your ground was the only currency that truly mattered. By the time the first snow of December dusted the high peaks, the cabin was finished. It was smaller than the first one, but sturdier. It had a stone chimney that drew perfectly, and thick shutters on the windows. Eliza planted a winter garden near the spring kale and turnips that would survive the frost. Colin built a fence, not to keep people out, but to keep the horses in. And on the corner of the porch, catching the breeze that flowed down from the mountains, he hung a wind chime. It was made of hollowed river reeds and bits of polished glass he had found in the creek. When the wind blew, it didn't howl anymore. It sang. The night they moved in, the valley was bathed in the silver light of a winter moon. The air was cold enough to snap a twig, but inside, the fire roared in the new hearth, casting a warm, orange glow over the fresh pine walls. There was no priest. There was no Bible. There was no crowd of witnesses. Colin stood by the fire, dressed in a clean shirt of white cotton that Eliza had sewn for him. Eliza stood opposite him, wearing a dress the color of sagebrush. "In my culture," Colin said, his voice low and serious, "we do not sign papers for the heart. Papers can burn. Papers can be stolen." "What do you do?" Eliza asked. "We promise to the elements," Colin said. "To the fire that warms, to the water that gives life, to the earth that holds us." He took a small pouch from his belt and poured a handful of corn pollen into Eliza's hand. He took a handful for himself. Colin," he said, looking straight into her eyes, "choose you. I choose to stand between you and the wind. I choose to walk with you until my feet can walk no more. I offer you my strength, my silence, and my blood." He tossed his pollen into the fire. It flared up, a brief, bright spark of gold. Eliza's heart was hammering, but her hand was steady. Eliza," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Choose you. I choose to be your rest. I choose to be your partner. I offer you my trust, which I have never given to another. I offer you my home and my life." She tossed her pollen. The fire accepted it, the sparks mingling with him in the chimney draft, rising up into the night sky to join the stars. They stood in the silence, the vows settling around them like a warm blanket. It was a simple ritual, unpretentious and stripped of all vanity. It was a promise made by two people who knew exactly what it cost to keep it. Colin stepped forward. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands. He looked at her not as a conquest, not as a prize he had won from Barlow, but as his equal. "Eliza," he whispered. He kissed her. It was slow and deep, tasting of the promise they had just made. Eliza melted into him, her arms going around his neck, pulling him closer. She had been a virgin. Yes, the town had defined her by that word, as if her value lay in her untouched state. But as Colin lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the bed covered in soft furs, Eliza realized that virginity was just a lack of history. Tonight, she was starting her history. She was not afraid. There was no hesitation, no trembling of the unknown. She had seen this man bleed. She had seen him fight. She knew the gentleness of his hands when he changed her bandages. She trusted him with her life. Trusting him with her body felt like the most natural step in the world. When he laid her down, he paused, his eyes asking the question one last time. "Are you sure?" his eyes said. Eliza reached up and unlaced the front of his shirt. "I am here," she whispered. "I am yours." The scene faded into the shadows of the flickering firelight. It was not a performance for the world. It was a private reclaiming of humanity. In the warmth of the cabin they had built together, Two lonely people found the one thing the harsh frontier could never provide: tenderness. Time moved on, indifferent to the dramas of men. The winter passed, white and silent. The spring came with a riot of wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, and bluebells carpeting the valley floor. The town of Pine Mesa shifted. A new sheriff was elected, a man who tipped his hat to Eliza when she rode in for supplies. Martha O'Rourke expanded her store, and she always kept a jar of peppermint sticks aside for when Eliza came to visit. One afternoon, Eli Briggs drove his stagecoach past the turnoff to the Hart homestead. He slowed the mules, looking up toward the stone cabin on the rise. He saw Eliza in the garden, her hands deep in the soil. She was wearing a wide-brimmed hat, and she was laughing. Beside her, repairing a gate, was Callan. He stopped his work to wipe his brow, looking over at her with a softness that softened the hard lines of his face. Eli smiled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Well, I'll be damned," the old man chuckled. "They are still standing. Two trees with the roots tangled deep." He snapped the reins. "Giddy up." The story of the virgin who built her cabin alone became a legend in the territory. But the truth was simpler and far more profound. Love did not fix the history of the West. It did not erase the lines drawn on the maps or the blood spilled in the dirt. The fences were still there. The laws were still hard. But love changed how they lived within that history. It gave them a shield against the cruelty of the world. It gave them a reason to endure the drought and the frost. As the sun set over the valley, painting the sandstone cliffs in shades of burning gold, the sound of water flowing over rocks filled the air, a constant, enduring music. Inside the cabin, the firelight danced on the new pine walls. High on the central beam, hanging by a strip of leather, was a small object. It was a piece of raw turquoise, bound together with a woven grass charm, a blend of two worlds. It swung gently in the draft, a silent witness to the truth they had forged. They had walked through the fire. They had faced the guns and the lies. And in the end, they had not just survived. They had triumphed. Not because they conquered the land, but because they had conquered the fear of being known. They were free. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope Eliza and Colin's journey touched your heart as much as it did mine writing it. There is something timeless about the grit of the Wild West and the power of love to bloom in the harshest soil. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. Are you in the bustling city dreaming of open plains? Or are you already out in the country? Let's share our stories in the comments. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, and hit that like button. And if you really want to help this story reach more people, please press the hype button to give it a boost. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these campfire stories alive. Until next time, keep your fire burning bright.